Welcome back to the Gaming News Canada show presented by Bead Gaming. I'm your host, Steve McAllister. For more than a year now, there's been much debate across the pond in the United Kingdom about the gambling industry and the tax rates imposed on operators of online gaming, retail sports betting, casino, horse racing, and other related businesses. Last month, the UK government announced increases on those taxes, including a spike from 21% to 40% of remote gambling beginning next April. The government is also increasing the general betting duty to 25%, and at the same time is providing an additional $49 million to its gambling commission to take action against the black market. The news struck a nerve with the industry and its stakeholders, many of whom are conducting business in both the Canadian and U.S. legal gaming markets. So, to walk us through the changing landscape with our friends from the Commonwealth, we welcome to the podcast Dan Waugh. Dan is a partner with Regulus Partners, a global strategic advisory business focused on the sports and leisure sectors. Regulus's regular reports on the global gaming industry are a must-read. He is also the former chair of the Young Gamblers Education Trust in the UK. Hey, Dan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for having me on.
Hey, I want to start off. Regulus does an incredible job following this industry, not only in the UK, but in jurisdictions around the world. And I just wonder, I think you've been around the gaming space for about 20 years now. Have you ever seen a crazier time in the gaming industry around the world?
I think if you decide to sort of work in this space, then you don't expect a quiet life. From a personal point of view, before I was working at Regulus, this is more than 11 years ago, I worked for the Rank Group, which is leading casino and bingo club operation in Britain. And in 2007, 2008, we had smoking bans come in. We had 2 sets of tax rises in 2 separate budgets, and we had a major new piece of legislation fully enacted, and we lost a large number of slot machines in our bingo clubs and some in our casinos. And the sky fell in on a repeated basis in those days. And it taught me a lesson, really. I think once you get past the sort of the anger of, railing at the gods as to why these things keep happening to you, it forces you to think about, well, why do these things keep happening to us? And that then forces you to recognize that it's a controversial industry. People have always had moral views about gambling. And in particular, Bill Edington wrote in a paper in 1999, problem gambling is the Achilles heel of the legal industry. And if you don't take care of your customers, this is what will happen. And yes, there's a lot going on in the world at the moment. It's very busy. But I think that's also a lesson, is that you can't compartmentalize risk. When you look at the risk of taxes going up or regulation biting, there's a tendency to think these things might happen in isolation. Quite often, that isn't the case, because it's the same things that drive them. So concern about customer well-being drives regulation, but also concern about customer well-being creates conditions where you're vulnerable to tax rises, because these can be seen as relatively unresented tax increases, which nobody's going to cry too much about. So no, it's busy, but in my experience, it's always busy.
Right. Dan, in your mind, is there a simple answer to what's prompted the government to impose this tax hike? And again, I'll just mention, you and I were talking before we hit the record button that this isn't an unusual action that we're seeing in the U.S. right now, where I think there's 4 or 5 states that have increased their tax rate. The state of New York currently has a 51% tax rate on its online sports betting industry. But is there one thing that kind of drove the UK government to take this action?
As Guns N' Roses almost wrote, an appetite for self-destruction. The budget over here, forget gambling, the budget was entirely chaotic. We had leaks pretty much every day about which taxes the Chancellor was going to raise, and various U-turns. Income tax was going to go up, and then that was U-turned upon. So it was a chaotic process. If you look at what they've done, raising the rate of online taxation for casinos from 21% to 40% is in itself a massive gamble. And I say that because Treasury can have no idea what happens next. If you push it up from 21 to 25 or 30%, there's a certain element of, well, what's the downside here? How bad could this be? When you virtually double it, you can have no idea what's going to happen next, which is why it's really quite rare to see taxes doubled overnight, but that is what Treasury is doing. So that leads me to believe that this is partly the fact that the economy is not in great shape and has not been in great shape for a while, and the government wants to raise taxation and sees gambling as a relatively unresented way to do that. But I think the scale of the increase on casino tax suggests to me it's political as well. That this is not really about all the things that it was claimed this was about. People claim that you could raise taxes and lift children out of poverty, as if there was some sort of line between these things. I don't think it's about that at all. I think to a degree, this was about seeming to be tough on the gambling industry and appeasing those MPs and others who dislike the industry and would like to see it punished. So it felt to me genuinely a punitive tax increase rather than something that was sound economic policy.
Hey, Dan, you wrote a piece for the Racing Forum last month on what you called the 5 great myths of the gambling tax debate. I don't need to go word by word through those great myths, but can you kind of summarize it for our audience?
Yeah, so I think there was a variety of look, the whole politicking and the whole lobbying around this tax has been confused and often quite dishonest. But we saw a whole range of myths, as we call it. I think I was going to call them untruths, and then I thought the lawyers might take exception. But we saw a whole load of myths get propagated. One was, where this started early in the year, that Treasury said it was looking to harmonise taxation for online gambling and online betting, online sports betting. They said, well, these are taxed at different rates. One's at 21, one's at 15. For the sake of simplicity, let's harmonise them. Now, I think that was a myth. It wasn't about simplicity or harmonisation. It was a tax raise because they certainly weren't going to bring down the rate of duty for online casino. So the only way you could ever level these things was to push up the rate of duty for online betting. So that was a myth. The claim that this would lift children out of poverty is a complete myth. Even those who suggested it said actually the money wouldn't be used to address benefits caps. It would just go into general taxation. And the proof of that, I guess, is that if it turns out that the tax raid backfires, if it turns out that actually Treasury gets in less money than it was taking before through a combination of lower duty receipts as customers exit the licensed market, but also employment taxes and other things, will the government reverse the benefits increase? Well, no, it won't. So that was a myth. There was a myth that this would reduce problem gambling somehow. And yet think tanks like the Social Market Foundation and the Institute for Public Policy Research, which proposed these taxes, they modeled no changes in consumer behavior. So they sort of said, look, if you double the rate of tax, you'll double the quantum of tax. Now, I think any sort of economist would say that was highly debatable. But if you believe their assumptions that actually spending was going to be unchanged by these tax rises, how in hell was that going to address problem gambling? The principal harm of problem gambling is a financial one. So if spending is unchanged, you're not doing anything about problem gambling by definition. So there were, it was, to say, a very dishonest debate. People made up numbers. The Social Market Foundation misrepresented government statistics and was called out on that by the Office for Statistics Regulation, which is our stats regulator. It was that's politics, I guess, but it was a pretty unsavory and dishonest process.
One thing that just kind of, it seems that there might have been this also caused a bit of a fractious relationship between different sectors of the gambling industry. And Zach Thomas Aku from Next.io wrote back in September about I'll actually read you the passage. It's, quote, gambling harms campaigners have outmaneuvered industry trade body, the Betting and Gaming Council, and convinced the horse racing sector that its interests are better served aligned with them. Dramatic tax rises and a new round of regulation and now on the cards. And that reminded me, Dan, a little bit of what kind of the debate in the U.S. about cannibalization and retail casinos complaining since the launch of online casino and online betting that was going to cut into retail casino. I think in Canada, there's been, I think Paul Burns at the Canadian Gaming Association, it's been pretty well promoted that's not the case, but it seems to have been a tougher road to hoe in the U.S., where you still only have 6 or 7 states with legal online gaming jurisdictions. Are you surprised, or I guess what is it really that fractious, the different sectors of the industry on the heels of this legislation?
I don't think it's that fractious. I wouldn't say within the industry it's too, and there are elements, but I don't think it's that fractious. But I would say you should never underestimate the ability of this industry to unload both barrels of a shotgun into its own feet. So I do think that the industry has not been as unified as it might be, but I think that's in the sense of they haven't pushed back collectively as much as they could have done, rather than necessarily that they've been fighting between themselves. On racing, I think it's perhaps slightly overgeneralized to say that racing as a whole took a view that was different to the industries. I think certain elements did, and certain elements got very, very close to campaigners who really have no love either for racing or for betting. And I think that's naive, and I think it will come back to haunt them. We've seen this in the past, that campaigners have over the we had a controversy about 8 years ago called the fixed odds betting terminals, which were machines in betting shops, and there was a successful campaign that ultimately that won to get rid of them, and that was supported by other elements of the gambling industry. So we do have a habit of this. I would say there's been less infighting this time around, though, personally. That said, I do think racing and betting were too far apart, and in some instances the anti-gambling campaigners were able to insinuate themselves between betting and racing, and who knows what effect that had, but it's not something you want.
Yeah, it's interesting here in Canada where the racetracks actually got a bit of a lift, probably I guess 20 years ago now, with slot machines coming into many of our racetracks, and that was a real boost to the industry at a time when horse racing needed it. I did some research for this episode, Dan, on the tax hikes and the impact of players leaving to go to the black markets. And I read one report the other day about in the Netherlands, their tax rates increased from 30.5% to 34.2%. And there's reporting that that's led to the black markets now outpacing the legal market in revenue. And in France, I also read another report where there's been a spike in the legal market participation in France, presumably because of tax rate changes. So there certainly does seem to be a case being made here that, I think, to your point, people are bet or are going to gamble. They're going to buy lottery tickets. They're going to do whatever, and they'll find ways to scratch that itch.
Yeah, I'm not sure you want me to say that. It's the black market has been growing in this country for a number of years, having been very low for a long time. The authorities have done a good job of keeping it low. It is growing. It has been growing for some time. The Office for Budget Responsibility, which is the state body that oversees the budget process in Britain, has written that it expects that black market will grow from here, and sort of sees that seems to be fairly sanguine about that. That's okay. That's just collateral damage from the tax increase. But yeah, there's an awful lot said and written about the black market. I think most people are sort of guessing because it is a criminal market, so it doesn't report, it doesn't pay taxes. But the way I look at it is, if there is a meaningful black market, the most interesting thing that says to me is that the state is preventing a meaningful number of its citizens from doing things they enjoy doing, that the regulated market does not work for them. And that, for me, is almost more important than issues around taxation and even potentially around consumer protection, because it's a signal that the state is not meeting the expectations of its citizens.
How much is online gambling, just the impact of online gambling? And I just wonder, is there any other form of gambling that's had the same dramatic impact as being able to place a wager or play blackjack off a mobile device?
In terms of how do you mean? What sort of impact?
I think just has there ever been on the gambling industry as a whole? It just sometimes it feels to me that the governments and regulators and other stakeholders weren't quite prepared for the boom that online gambling has been.
Yeah, so I think there are a number of key differences between online and land-based gambling. First of all, it's not constrained by physical space. And because of that, it means that you don't have if you run a casino, there will only be a certain number of casinos in town. So you have a certain share of the market by, as an economic rent. You've got defensible space, whereas that's not the same online. So what online tends to do is it spends a lot of money advertising and marketing, and in a way that land-based operators haven't felt the need to do so, because they're either the only game in town or one of several games in town. And what that does is, I think it creates some antagonism, because for gambling for a long time, it's been a pastime, it's been there, it's not really been in people's faces. And now you're putting it in the faces of people who may disapprove of it, or may just be sick of the crass nature of a lot of the advertising. I think you also get aggressive marketing because you're in such a competitive market, and some of that aggressive marketing backfires, whether it's in terms of ultimately encouraging consumers to engage in gambling in an immoderate way that then may lead them into difficulties, or in terms of advertising very appealing offers, but then there's a whole list of terms and conditions that the consumer doesn't read. So I think there is something in just the sheer openness of the market and the fact that you don't have the defensible space, which has led operators to behave in a way that society really didn't want them to. I think a lot is made of the accessibility of the market. I think perhaps too much is made of that. People say everyone's got a casino in their pocket. Well, they haven't really. The iPhone is not optimized for playing a game of roulette. It's better at online sports betting, but if you want to say that everyone has a casino in their pocket, then they have a bank in their pocket, they have a pornographic theatre in their pocket, they have all sorts of things in their pocket. So I think the accessibility point, I think, is somewhat overplayed, but not entirely. You can there are some things around, you can play 24 hours, but then in casinos you can as well. I think one big thing is that one big impact it's had is that because it collects so much data, every customer, you're able to track. It's now sort of switched on regulators to go, okay, so because you can track them, we should track them. So before online gambling, the idea that you would impose affordability checks, that you would inquire into the customer's finances, that you would track their play and expect the operator to intervene depending upon a whole raft of triggers, that would have not occurred to regulators because it wouldn't simply have been possible. And I think perhaps it wouldn't have been considered very democratic, or very liberal, the idea that you're surveilling people in that way. But because online gambling allows you to do that, and to a certain degree the operators are doing it themselves, it opens a door for regulators to be far more intrusive in the lives of consumers. And I think what you then see, and what we're seeing in Britain, is that then starts to seep across into land-based gambling, because the mentality is, well, look, if we can track gambling expenditures online, and if we can require certain interventions and surveil customers online, why can't we do that in land-based premises? So you start to see that creep in, where the Gambling Commission starting to sort of say, well, perhaps if we could require, I think that the sort of wet dream of the Gambling Commission in this country is that every single gambling transaction is tracked, and the state has the power to intervene or to require operators to intervene if it is thought that the consumer is spending beyond what they should. And I expect at some point, that the low risk Canadian gambling guidelines might even come into play here. No more than 2 activities per month. No more 2 activities, no more than 4 days gambling per month. I think we can start. I know that's not what they're intended for, but it would not surprise me in the next 5 years if we start to see regulators suggest to operators that they should be enforcing those guidelines.
Ready to accelerate your digital growth? Bead Gaming delivers a market-leading platform with best-in-class products driven by secure, cutting-edge technology. With an open API platform, robust integration suite, and unlimited configurability, you can achieve the ultimate end-to-end customization for your iGaming ambitions. Bead Gaming is your partner for success. Get in touch at beadgaming.com. I want to go back to the UK government announcement for a second, Dan, and that's, in terms of the potential impact on the economy. And Entain came out with a statement as soon as it was announced last 2 weeks ago now. They came out with a statement. Per Widstrom from Evoke came out. He had a town hall with 2,000 employees talking about it. I read a story the day before we recorded the interview about operators and suppliers in Gibraltar who are concerned about the impact on their businesses there. I mean, how real is that economic impact?
Well, we won't know until time will tell, but the risk is definitely there. I think some of the anti-gambling lobbyists like the Social Market Foundation have claimed that this is all scaremongering. Well, look, I think that's quite naive. Listed companies don't put out statements like that in order to scaremonger. If they do, they're in trouble with the Financial Conduct Authority. You cannot mislead the market for lobbying purposes, no matter what some of these think tankers might imagine. So, no, I think the risk is very real. Even before this, they were paying high rates of taxation. Once you put duty in with employment taxes, business rates, other taxes they pay, it was an already highly taxed industry. Some businesses may not survive this. That's true. And the knock-on effects of that, we will see. We will see jobs lost because that's already been stated. We'll see the supply chain impacted. And although if you go look at employment, although the online gambling industry employs a relatively small number, I think it's about 10,000 people in Britain, those jobs are concentrated in certain geographical locations. So Stoke-on-Trent, for example, Leeds or Sunderland. And the idea that's been suggested by some of the anti-gambling campaigners is they can get other jobs. Well, it ignores the fact that unemployment is already rising in this country anyway. And in certain parts of the country, it's a real issue. So if you lose a lot of jobs in Stoke, it's not obvious that there's going to be a lot of people creating new jobs, to take them up. In fact, it's, the online gambling industry in Stoke has provided employment to people that would have been otherwise in a lot of trouble. So, and then there are knock-on effects on racing. Even though racing has had a carve-out from the tax increase itself, racing is heavily dependent upon the betting industry. So if the betting industry is cutting costs, racing will be impacted. Other sports which benefit from sponsorships like rugby league and darts will be hit. Low league football will be hit. So, as I said at the start, it's a big gamble. And there is a risk that I have a list here of things that could go wrong. You could see the black market grow, or you will see the black market grow. They've admitted that. You will see jobs lost. Gibraltar, which is a hub for the online gambling industry, is a crown dependency. Its economy could be completely undermined here. And that then has political dimensions because of the sort of ongoing status of Gibraltar between United Kingdom and Spain. The funding for treatment, gambling disorder treatment is funded via a statutory levy. It has been since April. 80% or more of that statutory levy is funded by the online gambling industry, by consumer expenditures in the regulated market. So if the regulated market for online gambling gets hit, treatment providers for people with gambling disorder will be defunded. And that's a simple mathematical equation. So there's all these things that could go horribly wrong as a result of the tax increase. Some of them the government's acknowledged, some of it hasn't. Time will tell, but it could be an absolute catastrophe. And at the end of it may not even raise any more money.
I'm probably not going to ask this question the right way, Dan. Is there a proper formula for determining tax rates? I mean, in Ontario, I think it's 20%, and one thing that operators and different stakeholders around Ontario will laud the government and the Alcohol and Gaming Commission of Ontario, iGaming Ontario, for when they created this market, was that there was a fairly extensive consulting process that led to that tax rate being established. And I think there is somewhat of proof in the pudding with 48 operators in Ontario and basically 50 operators doing business here since the market opened in April 2022. But is there a way to determine a tax rate that's fair for everybody?
I think fairness is a fairly subjective
Yeah.
idea. No, I don't think so. I think you can't look at tax in isolation. So you have to take a look at tax in the context of the regulation and the licensing. So if for example, as I know has been the case in Canada in the past, if you have very limited licensing, i.e. you're giving the chance to operate these businesses to one or two operators,
right,
or a handful of operators, depending upon which province, then you can afford to tax the industry at a higher rate because there's low competition. So therefore, operators don't have to spend as much on marketing, etc. They have higher margins. You can afford to tax it more. In a very open market, then tax needs to be a lot lower in order for. And you can see that in the US casinos market, for example. So I could be wrong here. So then I'll admit that, but I think it's in Pennsylvania 50% on casinos, but they've only got a relatively small number. You go to Vegas, it's 6.75%, but then they've got 400 not in Nevada. So I think you have to look at taxation in the context of licensing, but also regulation. What is the regulator doing here? Because ultimately, all these things come together to say is the market functioning in a healthy way, and taxation has to be recalibrated against that rather than in isolation. And then obviously you have to think about, well, what is the policy here? What does the government want to achieve with this market? Does it see it as something that is as a positive that plays an important role, whether it's tourism or whether it's as part of the leisure economy? Or is it licensing gambling in order to control it because it's concerned about black market? So you really have to understand what is the outlook from the government. Because if the government, as they do in some jurisdictions, just not Great Britain, sees the gambling industry as something that is good because people enjoy it, it gives them fun, it brings people in from outside the area to spend their money, then you would set a low tax because you want to support the growth of the industry. If you don't think it's very good and you want to constrain investment by operators and you want to constrain consumer spending, then you may tax it at a higher rate. But so there's no single logic to determine this. I think from Treasury's point of view in this country, they've always been fairly agnostic on some of the social issues. And I've really just said, the social issues, that's for another department to think about. What we want to do is make sure that the yield is sustainable and maximized. So what's sort of the best we can get without tipping this market in the wrong direction? What was slightly concerning about this budget is that Treasury seemed to justify the tax rises on the basis of harm prevention, which sort of makes no sense at all, because you don't reduce harms from gambling by increasing the cost of the consumer to gamble. That makes no sense at all. So it's a little bit concerning that the Treasury has normally been very sort of, strict about keeping to, no, this is about maximizing the fiscal system. It started to stray into, gambling can be harmful as a justification for increasing taxes.
Something that we've written about and talked about here at Gaming News Canada, Dan, for 4+ years now has been, the lack of people willing to tell the story around regulated gambling. And I've written it quite often. I mean, Paul Burns from the Canadian Gaming Association, he's often a man on an island telling the story. The provincial government hasn't told a very good job. Again, this is a place where there's been more than $1 billion in tax revenue generated, and there doesn't seem to be a story around that. And I just wonder, is it the same? It's in the same case in the UK. I mean, you have a betting council there. You have a UK gambling commission. You have politicians. You have operators. You have a supply chain there. Has there been shortcomings when it comes to telling the story about the benefits of a regular gambling industry?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the the 21st century history of gambling in Great Britain starts with a report called the Budd Report, named after its chairman, Sir Alan Budd, who was a friend of mine. And in that report, it's very clear that what they're trying to do is strike a balance. They recognize that adults enjoy gambling. We've been doing it for millennia. And that the rights of those adults to pursue their enjoyment should be encouraged and should be permitted. At the same time, there's a recognition that some people do experience harms from gambling, including some very severe harms, and they should be protected. And therefore, the job of regulation is to achieve some sort of balance between protection and freedom and enjoyment. That's never a constant state. That's always going to be something that will be oscillating. But that was the logic then. I think these days we've seen the mobilization of a sort of radical form of public health in Great Britain and in other jurisdictions, and I suspect it's probably coming to parts of North America at least, which attempts to claim that gambling is the new tobacco, that somehow this is an inherently harmful activity that confers no benefits on consumers. And I think if you're being critical of the British industry, it's been largely passive as this story has been told. We've seen the parts of our health ministry invent statistics on gambling harms, and the industry's really done nothing to push back on that, even though these are demonstrably untrue. In fact, we've demonstrated these are untrue. And at the same time, the industry sort of fallen into a trap of sort of constantly going, oh, well, we're better than the black market. The black market, yes, we are trying to reduce harm, but we're better than the black market. Now, the black market's an important consideration, but really, if an industry cannot defend itself on the benefits it brings to its consumers, then it really is in trouble. So I think the industry over here has not done a good job of sorry, my cat is yeah, he does this. I think the industry's not done a great job of really reminding people that the gambling industry doesn't create gamblers. This is something that's been in our DNA for millennia. People enjoy doing it. People get benefits from it in terms of socialization, intellectual stimulation, sort of escape and entertainment, some time out of the humdrum, all that sort of stuff, all these things that, people come to gambling for. And the industry's really been silent on those things, despite, pretty good evidence that that's what's going on. And it's allowed at the same time, these public health radicals to really invent statistics to sort of try to sort of allege that gambling is this new tobacco, which is completely false. But the industry's losing. And that's, you saw that last week in the budget. But I think I saw one analyst note that says, now the budget's out the way, the industry's got certainty. I don't think that's true at all. They've had a bad result in the budget. I think some sectors escaped. So land-based gambling escaped in the budget, but there were calls for taxes to go up on land-based gambling. I think those calls will come back. We will see stepped up calls for advertising bans and tougher affordability checks, product bans. People, some of the campaigners want slots banned, online slots. Some want in-play betting banned. So there's a whole list. There's even our public health ministry has even said, and this is bizarre, I admit, but they've even called for plain packaging on all gambling products. This is 3 years ago in a paper in the Lancet. And when you said, well, what's that? You looked it up and it said no colors, logos, or images on any gambling products. So your deck of cards in a casino is suddenly illegal.
Right.
So I think that gives you an idea about how fixated on this idea of gambling as a new tobacco is. And if that is, if they want to get a World Health Organization framework control agreement like the one they have for tobacco, that's a stated aim of public health in this country. So it won't stop. It will keep coming at you. The tax rise is just the outward manifestation of a much deeper campaign to essentially shut down licensed gambling in Great Britain and in other markets. So I think unless something changes in the way the industry responds to this, the industry's in for further torrid times, I'm afraid.
Dan, you and the rest of the team at Regulus, you follow what's going on around the world, as I mentioned in the introduction. Is there one in your mind, is there one country or one jurisdiction, one state, one province that is doing regulated gambling pretty well right now? Like, is there a poster child?
I don't know, and for interest of declaration, I tend to spend most of my time looking at UK. My partner Paul Leyland spends more of his time looking internationally. In years gone by, you might have said Great Britain because it was relatively liberal. It was the first major economy to really legislate for online gambling, and therefore had a time to sort of work it out and put in controls. But I think it's now there are signs that Britain is starting to leave the ranch. So I don't think it's Britain anymore at all. I'm not sure there is. Denmark maybe. Denmark's been still relatively sensible. Netherlands has gone very illiberal, but at least there it's market regulator. I think this is quite interesting. Its market regulator is actively calling out and saying, no, you can't keep doing this. The black market's growing. You are undermining the objectives of regulation here. So, and that's quite rare. In Britain, and this gives you a sign of the trouble we're in, our gambling commission, our market regulator, has actually lobbied our finance ministry, Treasury, to increase taxes on licensees. That's insane. They're not meant to do that. They did it. Nobody seems to be considering. The industry sort of is afraid of the commission, so never challenges them on things like this. But so I think maybe Denmark, best you can point to.
Hey, Dan, last question. I mentioned earlier about Alberta that, and we wrote in the newsletter today, we're recording this interview on Wednesday, December 3rd, that, we know there's going to be a regulated market coming to Alberta sometime in 2026. Is there, based on experience and based on your reporting and following the industry, like are there a couple of things that Alberta should focus on and trying to get the market right when they launch, just based on everything, especially based on everything you're seeing in the UK right now?
Yeah, I think what we've learned from market openings, over a period of time, probably starting with Italy, but carrying on through, is what happens. Markets open. There are too few restrictions and controls on operators, particularly on marketing. It's excessive. So you see, suddenly wall-to-wall advertising for a population that isn't really used to it. You see behavior by operators that is not really in keeping with customer well-being and customer care, aggressive marketing. And then there's a backlash. And then the industry is going into reverse and the taxes are going up and the regulations getting tighter. And I don't think that's good for operators. And I don't think it's good for the consumer. And it's not really good for the jurisdiction. So I think it is far better to take a cautious and controlled approach. Restricting licensing can be a good thing to do rather than just encouraging a completely open market. Putting in place sensible restrictions on advertising, putting in standards around the structural characteristics of games like speed of play, stake sizes, things like this. So I think it's all to try and look at this and go, okay, what is the market that's best in the interest of the consumer here? How do we create that market? Because it's in nobody's interests for the market to be too liberal to start with and then to swing back in the opposite direction and become too restricted. But that is what we've seen in market after market after market. So I think if there's a lesson for Alberta, really think through the consequences, really look at how the consumer is affected by this, look at how society as a whole is likely to feel about this. And it's much easier to be cautious, gradually liberalize the market, than to liberalize in one big, swoop and then have to try to retrench. From an operator's perspective, really learn from the experiences of other markets, particularly in Europe, because we've been doing this longer. We've made all the mistakes. But I know in talking to some parties in the US, not all, but some parties in the US, there's all been a mentality of what can we learn from Europe? That's the old world. I'm not saying that that would be a Canadian perspective, but I think some operators in the US have, and yet they've gone and made the same mistakes. Those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it.
That is Dan Waugh from Regulus Partners. Dan, if people want to subscribe, your newsletters or reports are fantastic. If someone wants to access those reports, how do they do that?
Good question. We have a distribution list, which I'm not in charge of. I think they have to email us because of our data protection laws. You would have to send an email. If people want to email me, it's dan.waugh, which is WAUGH, at reguluspartners.com. If you send me an email, I can ask you to get on our list. And thanks for the plug.
Yeah. Oh, I wish I could tell you too, Dan, but the emails just show up my inbox. So I know as much as you do on that one. Hey, Dan, thanks so much for doing this. Really insightful. And this is obviously, I think, while this issue is happening thousands of kilometers away right now, it certainly is an issue that has an impact on what's going on in the gaming industry here in Canada.
Yep.
That's
the
it.
issues are the same of the world around, I think.
That's it for this episode of the Gaming News Canada Show presented by Bead Gaming. Again, thanks to Dan Waugh for joining us. You can find this and all of our podcasts on the various podcast apps. And also you can watch this interview with Dan Waugh on our YouTube channel, the Gaming News Canada YouTube channel. Thanks again for everybody for listening and watching this program, and we will see you real soon.